You're listening to the J Report Talk Radio on PTN Network.
Welcome back, folks. This is Marc Steiner right here on the Marc Steiner Show, and your source for cool jazz and more, WEAA 88.9 FM, the voice of the community. And, you know, we have this ongoing relationship with the Reginald F. Lewis Museum downtown, and something is coming up on April the 1st, identifying family traditions from the Work Progress Administration's slave narratives that happened in the 1930s. And we are joined by Dr. Iyelli Ichile, who is a postdoc fellow in African American history at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum and the Department of Africana Studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, who joins us. She's working on all this stuff and has looked at the slave narratives out of that project of the slave narratives of Marylanders. So welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, you know, let's go back to the beginning here and talk a little bit about WPA,
Sure.
what they actually did and what they collected and when.
Right. So FDR sends out approximately 6,600 writers, just as a part of the Works Progress Administration, but specifically the Federal Writers Project. He's trying to create jobs, and these are mostly working class people. They're mostly young, mostly white.
But not all white.
Not all white. Most
So Neil Houston, many other famous folks were
absolutely,
right.
absolutely, and hopefully we'll talk about them in a minute.
Yeah.
But they are sent out to collect what eventually becomes kind of a body of writing about kind of the common man in this country, the everyday man, the people whose stories who are not typically recorded and remembered as part of significant history. And in collecting these stories of the folk, one major project is the slave narratives. The goal is to collect as many narratives of formerly enslaved people as possible, and they collect about 2,300 narratives nationwide.
Amazing. And we're talking 90 years or so after the end of legal slavery in America.
Absolutely. It's amazing.
It is amazing. And so you focused your work on the narratives over these 89 pages that came out of Maryland.
Yes. So for the purposes of my work at the Reginald Lewis, I've been able to kind of just focus on the Maryland narratives. However, there are so many that I've looked at because they are also connected with Virginia, Pennsylvania, right. The Carolinas. I mean, then because the average enslaved person is moved about 7 times during his or her life, and so changes hands and changes ownership, and so the narratives are based in Maryland, at least in part, but they connect to other places as well.
So I'm curious, when you look at these narratives, how many were there altogether?
I
should know this since I have it in front of me.
Maybe 13, 12. I don't know, maybe more than that.
Maybe I only had a chance to get through like 3/4 of them before you came in the door, because I wasn't, but I did get through a lot of them. Yeah, it looks like about that. And so the names, some of them are familiar too, which is interesting to me, from Maryland. So
yes.
Really,
okay,
yeah.
right. We didn't ask those questions about the last names and who.
Right.
Yeah.
Foote, the Max.
Right.
The Wiggins. I mean, these are names that Henson.
Yes.
Right. So
names of
I'm
people
curious
we
to see
know,
if
schools,
their descendants are like
still alive and well and walking among us.
and may not know these stories.
Right.
Or may. We don't know.
Right.
So I'm curious, what as a historian, and as a black woman growing up in this country, what kind of shocked you about the narratives? What hit you about the narratives that you were not expecting as you read through them?
I think I would have answered the question differently when I was a younger person.
You're so old right now.
I am so old, right? But I should say before I got a Ph.D. in history.
I'm teasing you.
Right? Yes. But I think after kind of going through my training, which I owe all the credit to my professors at Howard University in the history department, which has its own connection to these stories. I think what really struck me looking at the narratives again as a more seasoned scholar is what I didn't see in the narratives. They are a wealth of information, certainly about the kind of geography and the mapping of where people were located and the different types of labor that were involved in slavery. the types of foodways and the family relationships, or the ways in which family relationships were ruptured by trade and sale and displacement. However, I think that, again, going back later as a scholar, I was kind of struck by what I didn't see in the stories that I didn't hear that I had learned about in other places. The narratives. I think John Blassingame, who wrote The Slave Community, he actually described the narratives as simplistic and talked about the ways in which they kind of depict slavery as too positive.
These narratives do?
Yes.
I was going to ask that question. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just say this: when I first started graduate school in the history program, my advisor said, "Okay, if you want to study the history of slavery in this country, be prepared. It is like reading a horror film. You are the ones who will go into the archives and read the papers, the honest to goodness what happened, and it is trauma, and you must be ready to kind of sort through it, because the narratives that we have inherited are not telling the whole story." And I think going back and looking at the narratives, we have to think about, these are African people or people of African descent who are in their, the twilight years of their lives, and they are being interviewed by mainly white people, white interviewers. So there is still a racial etiquette. This is the 1930s. This is the aftermath of the Great Depression. Tensions, lynching, the height of lynching in this country. Jim Crow, of course, is at its height. So there is an etiquette about what is acceptable to say and what is not acceptable to say.
So skewed because so many of the interviewers were white, and what their relationship might have been in a subservient sense, in a fearful sense, in other ways.
Right, because these dynamics continue, of course, after legal emancipation, and so there is so much truth and so much richness in the narratives. However, you've got kind of the strategy of concealment of certain types of narratives, certain types of stories that some people may not have felt comfortable sharing with interviewers they didn't know. And then the interviewers themselves, you actually see a lot of their own voices in the narratives, and there's a ton of editing that happens on the back end as well.
So did you see it? Maybe you didn't, because maybe they didn't exist in Maryland when you were studying, but was there a difference between how a formerly enslaved person would respond to Zora Neale Houston or Charles S. Johnson when they were interviewing people, as opposed to when white folks were interviewing people?
Absolutely. And that is it's interesting because, so for instance, there is a collection of papers, the Ophelia Settle Egypt papers, which you can find at the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard. And there were groups of, African-American scholars who went out in the 1920s, the early 30s, and got this started before the Federal Writers Project kind of joined the collection process.
Right.
And, when you read stories that are collected by the African-American researchers, you have way more evidence of resistance. You have a greater kind of appreciation of the experiences of women and children in slavery and the brutality. And I think, so for instance, there's a stark contrast between kind of an overabundance of, the games that enslaved children played that you find as a major theme in the Federal Writers Project. But
and the food.
Right. The
and
food that they ate.
And nobody got whipped on this plantation. Nobody was beaten on this plantation.
And there's always that emphatic statement. No one was whipped.
Right.
Ever. No one ran away, or I only saw one person run away in my life.
Right. There was a number of them. Right.
And so those, the agency of the enslaved people to resist is kind of minimized and not written about very heavily, certainly not in a lot of detail in most of the narratives, not all. It certainly comes through in some of them, but when you read those collected by African American researchers, those themes that kind of give that agency back and talk about those intra-group dynamics are much more apparent.
So were any of the interviewers African American in Maryland, or were they all white people?
I think, to my recollection, there may have been one or two, although I'm still kind of working on that. I'm still trying to figure out who is who. So
does any one particular narrative pop out at you that really grabs you for any number of strange and interesting and frightening but powerful reasons?
Right. Well, My direct supervisor, Charles Bethea, he's the chief curator and head of collections at the museum. He and I are interested in looking at slave pens and slave jails and ways
Pens, P-E-N-S,
right,
obviously.
further incarcerating people who are already captive on the plantations for reasons of punishment for certain perceived infractions. And there's a narrative here that really describes one of the plantations, I guess, that has kind of this elaborate jail. They have the big house and they have the slave quarters, but people don't really understand that some situations, some estates had jails built on the property, to in which to punish folks. And so there's I think it's Silas Jackson.
Yes, I read that one. Right.
And Silas Jackson was actually born in Virginia. But he talks about this elaborate jail in which the men were kept underneath the ground and the women were kept above ground, and there was some, sexual abuse going on with the women. And, it's rare to read that amount of detail about negative, violent experiences. And certainly the experiences of women were talked about in very polite ways, if at all.
Because he was a little boy then.
Right.
When that makes me think of there's another narrative I read in there about who was also one of the white people were nice, but they did whip people, and he talks about how terrified he was hearing this person being whipped and seeing that, those things were there.
Right.
But they were actually not as prevalent as I would have expected in these narratives.
Exactly. And I think from what I understand, the spectacle of the violence was important for all of the other enslaved people. And in many cases, they were forced to watch, regardless of their age. And that is, Black children and white children were forced to watch the violence as a part of a desensitizing process, because the violence is inherently necessary to enslave otherwise reasonably intelligent people who naturally want freedom as humans. And so this is a part of the thingification process, desensitizing people to this level of violence and bloodshed. And so for them to say, oh, I didn't see it, but I heard it, or I wasn't around, or I never heard, that to me is a red flag, because that goes completely against everything I've learned about slavery from the perspective of the slaveholders themselves, because, you can also read their journals and their diaries and their accounts of what they've done. And there are copious records on that as well.
Have you read those as well?
They were a lot less polite about what they did. Yes, absolutely. Because, according to their worldview, this was not a problem. It wasn't an issue. It wasn't a moral dilemma for many people who owned other people.
So what for our listeners who might come listen to this on April the 1st, what for you is the power of the narrative? What do people walk away with from this? Just because you also, when we have these programs, some people, not everybody, but a few people call and go, I'm so tired of hearing slave narratives.
Yeah.
I want to hear about modern stuff.
Right.
But there's unless we understand the roots, we understand where we are.
Right.
In many ways, right?
Right. Well, this is a direct relationship to what we're dealing with now. I think in some people's minds, the passage of the 13th Amendment meant that, all of Euro-America woke up and just let go of all those attitudes and ideas.
Oh, they didn't?
No, sorry. I wish it had, but
yeah, me too.
No, but and so we really have to deal with what Martin Luther King calls the thingification of people of African descent in this country and other countries in the Western world. These narratives are just a very small glimpse into the lives and experiences of people who are in the process of recovering their status as human beings in the world. And that's what's important about these narratives. They had relationships. They had a value system. You can read that in the narratives. You can see that family was central, the connectedness to one's parents, the taking time at the end of back-breaking labor to sit with each other and tell stories, or to braid someone's hair. Those are therapeutic traditions. Those are caring traditions that speak back to the fact that these are human beings who had a will to live and love and have, exist. And these are the things that are remembered by octogenarians and people who are 90. These moments matter to them, and I can't even remember when I was 7, 8, 9 years old half the time. And so there was an effort made among enslaved people to mark out the significance of their lives. And that's what I think is important about any kind of narrative that we have been able to collect.
You know, what you just described, and the two things popped out when you, the storytelling and hair braiding.
Yes.
That I kind of feel for the roots of that in the black world today, right? And the key role that those two phenomena play in the black world. And
They're still with us.
right? And so, I mean, to understand the roots of that being a tool of liberation, of mastering something when you were being mastered.
Absolutely.
Right?
Right. Mastering yourself. I mean, even something as we think of as basic as a hair braid, a braiding pattern, these had significance. I mean, these people didn't come from an African society and then just get wiped clean of all cultural understandings of themselves and the world. And so, when they were braiding hair, it meant, okay, I care about you. You're a person. This hair can signify who you are. I mean, a hair braiding pattern can indicate your status in society, the merits you had earned, the honor you had shown as an individual, whether you were married or not. Women began to braid maps into each other's hair. To freedom. This is the river. This is where you go if you're trying to get to this other place. I mean, there was deep significance to everything that we did, and certainly it had to take on new meanings in this new context. But I mean, if we look at today and the ways in which certain Black cultural practices are seen as threatening, are seen as primitive or less than, inferior, that is a carryover, but also what I'm interested in doing, and especially, April 1st, I hope to talk more about this, is getting us to really appreciate and understand all of the deep philosophical and political meanings of the things that we still do. Because we're still, again, the reason why we have to say Black Lives Matter, the reason we have to declare that
Still have to say it.
is because of this history, and this is why the narratives are important, and this is the direct connection to today. We are still seeking that out.
Well, it's important for people to understand these narratives. It's important for people who are not just Black folks to understand these narratives.
Right.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? I mean, there's an awakening, and this is part of the awakening. And having young scholars like yourself opening that door to help in the awakening,
right,
I think is really critically important.
This is the start. This is reading things like this really help us get an understanding of people on both sides of the issue and how much more work we have to do. What are we trying to unpack in our interactions with each other in this society that we have to live in together?
Are there any of the stories that kind of hit you that stayed in your head as you were reading them, and maybe ones that maybe were juxtaposed against another?
One of my favorite kind of victorious stories, one of my favorite triumphant stories, and I'm a scholar that focuses on the experiences of women, enslaved African women, and resistance. That's my wheelhouse. Gotcha. And so one of my yes, an understudied wheelhouse. I am very lonely, but is Thomas Foote, I believe. Thomas Foote was free, right?
Yeah, I read that one. That's a really good one.
It's amazing, and I love his mother because she's the centerpiece of this story to me. She's a free woman who is a midwife and a healer, and her herbs and her stones or crystals are more effective than the doctor who's going around trying to cure people.
They took that stone off this one enslaved man and said that she gave it to him and it heals everything around.
Heals everything, right. The doctor couldn't figure it out, and this man is on, knocking on death's door, and then she comes in, and but eventually she's jailed. She's put in jail for this, for her effectiveness, essentially because she's practicing quote unquote voodooism.
Right.
And spirituality.
Not sorcery, that'd be European. This is voodooism.
Right, voodooism. And the word voodoo is so troublesome in the English language, not to be confused with voodoo, which is actually a religion.
Right.
But this not only connects to the stories of enslaved women, but really many women who practice midwifery, many women who practice, outside of kind of the growing, kind of elaborating, kind of male Western medical establishment there was a witch hunt. I mean, there's a reiteration of this witch hunt idea, and they are jailed, they are killed, they are attacked, and so she she is kind of a part of this, but the community supported her. The community understood her value and her significance. And these are a part of our traditions. And now we can go and kind of go to Whole Foods and, because they actually list some herbs in here, which is really useful. Some of these enslaved people are talking about bone set and life everlasting and all these wonderful herbs. And you can look them up now and on the internet, and you can go to the store and buy an essential oil that is now we figued out.
But she was doing it then.
Right. And so that's that. I love stories like that because, essentially we are sometimes engaging in our own culture. We just don't know it. We have to kind of go to Whole Foods and purchase our culture back, that really kind of was already in existence. And it speaks to the relationship with indigenous folks, with the native folks of this land that we learned so much from in order to continue our traditions. We understood the importance of herbalism. I mean, that's a part of everyone's tradition. It's just some folks underwent a process of forgetting in the name of colonization, in the name of, the building of capitalism.
Right.
But,
right.
She represents kind of a return to giving it its proper value.
Dr. Iyelli, Ichile, it was a pleasure to have you in the studio. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're listening to the J Report Talk Radio on PTN Network.